Good evening and welcome to Hardfire. I'm your host, Joseph Dobrian, and I'm bringing you another half hour of conversation and current events from a libertarian perspective. Now, our guest tonight, all the way from Washington, D.C., is Dr. Stephen Baskerville, who has come out with a new book called Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Children, a Father's Marriage, and the Family. Dr. Baskerville, welcome.
Thank you.
And tell me about your book. Is there really a war on fathers, marriage, and the family? And if so, how does your book describe it?
Well, very much so, and it's a very multifaceted war. I concentrate, for the most part, on what takes place through the divorce machinery. Many people have a very inaccurate view of what divorce is in this country as two people mutually agreeing to end their marriage. More often it's a power grab by one spouse and by the government.
Well, often that takes place because of the legal procedures involved, correct?
That's right. The legal industry is essentially a massive machine that not only favors divorce, but actually imposes it on unwilling people against their will.
Can you explain how that is the case? How can the legal system impose divorce on people who don't wish to be divorced?
Well, since the advent of no-fault divorce, which is really unilateral or involuntary divorce, one spouse, with the aid of the government machinery, can unilaterally divorce the other spouse. But it's even more serious than that. The involuntarily divorced spouse can be thrown out of their home. Their rights, their movements, their finances are controlled from that point by the court and by the government. And perhaps most serious of all, their relationship with their children is controlled. They can be cut off from their children completely. Their visitation with their children is tightly regulated. They can be forced to pay extortionate amounts of money, ostensibly for the maintenance and upkeep of their children in the form of child support. They can be shaken down for legal fees of lawyers and psychotherapists they have not hired. Essentially, through involuntary divorce, the government seizes control of your private life, including your finances, your relationship with your children, even your movements.
Okay, now you say that this is a war against fathers. Doesn't it affect mothers pretty badly as well, or is it mostly fathers?
It can in many instances. Today, the most serious weapon in the divorce arsenal is children. It is children that are the main battleground. The fights over child custody, the child support, alleged domestic violence accusations and child abuse accusations for purposes of obtaining custody. Children have become the weapons, and most often children are the weapons of mothers, of women. But it's not always the case. The genders can be reversed. There are many instances where fathers use the children against the mothers as well. But overwhelmingly, the crisis that we hear so much about of fatherless children is not fathers deserting their families at all. It's more often fathers being involuntarily ejected from their family by family courts.
Well, one hears this a great deal, and one hears of children being played off by one or the other or both parents. But is this actually encouraged by the legal industry or by the government, or is this just something that people do when they're divorcing because they get nasty with each other?
No, it's very much not only encouraged, but made almost unavoidable by the government. The courts effectively side with the parent that creates litigation for them. The court sides with the parent that wants to divorce, that wants to seize unilateral sole custody of the children. This creates business for the court. It creates earnings for lawyers, for forensic psychotherapists, for social workers, for a huge entourage of clients, patronage clients, that exist at the bidding of the judge for the most part. So the judge has a financial and political incentive to encourage as much divorce as possible, and therefore to side with the party that is most belligerent, that wants the divorce, that wants sole custody of the children.
Okay, so does that mean that if my wife and I are getting divorced and there's no hard feelings between us and we want to keep it as simple and as painless and as amicable as possible, then we will be discouraged from doing that?
Not necessarily. If there's genuine goodwill and there's genuine bilateral relations and amicability, then it is possible. But very few divorces are that way. Actually, about 80% of divorces in this country are unilateral. They are over the objection of one spouse. It's more often one spouse in a power grab, where he, or more often she, seizes the children, then either departs with the children, flees, goes to somebody else, to a parent's house or a sister's house or a domestic violence shelter, alleges trumped-up charges about domestic violence or child abuse against the other spouse, seizes sole control of the children, uses the children as weapons to extract child support, and other forms of payment.
Okay, now let me play devil's advocate for a moment. You bring up the question of spousal abuse, and in some cases I dare say that that is concocted, but I would guess that in large part it's absolutely true, and the spouse does have to run out of the house, sometimes taking the children along, and seek refuge with another relative or in a shelter or something like that. In that case, it seems to me that a unilateral divorce action might sometimes be inevitable. Isn't that the case?
That is the case in very few instances. In fact, there is overwhelming evidence, and quite a number of scholars have documented this, that trumped-up accusations of spousal abuse and child abuse are now out of control in this country. They are made without any due process of law, without any introduction of any forensic evidence into the court, without any formal charge in most instances. The accused spouse is summarily evicted from the home, cut off from all contact with his or her children, usually his children, and ordered to make child support payments. And this is very well known. The courts don't even pretend otherwise. This is, in fact, we can show you documentation that shows that most domestic violence, hysteria, and accusations are directly connected with questions of divorce and child custody.
Okay, so what sorts of solutions do you propose for this situation?
Well, there's a number of things. We need to restore due process of law to the divorce proceedings. Accusations should be made only with evidence. There should be formal charges. There should be criminal charges when there is domestic violence or child abuse alleged. And there should be criminal protections as well for the accused, due process protections. There should also be a presumption of shared parenting in the case of divorce or unwed childbearing, where all else being equal, parents share custody of the children rather than fighting over them. There should also be, there's a very old body of parental rights, of guarantees for the rights of parents to the care and custody of their children, which has been basically overturned over the last 20 or 30, 40 years.
What are some of those rights that are no longer enforced?
Well, there's a very ancient body of precedents going back to the English common law, in fact, saying that parents have a liberty interest in the care and custody and raising of their children. And a large body of precedent going back decades, if not centuries. And these precedents need to be enforced. Instead, what we have is the substitution of a standard known as the best interest of the child, whereby courts and other government officials can substitute their judgment of what is in the best interest of other people's children, children they don't even know in most instances, over the rights, the fundamental liberty interest rights of parents to raise their own children as they see fit.
Okay. I'm a pretty old man now, and I can remember back in the 1960s when people got divorced, custody was almost automatically awarded to the mother with very limited visitation rights for the father. And then it seemed like in the 1970s and 80s there was a shift more towards shared custody, and or perhaps it was easier for the father to gain sole custody if he were the proper parent to have it. Now, are we seeing a shift back to what we saw in the 1950s and 60s when custody was almost automatically the mother's?
I'm not sure there's ever actually been a true shift. There are no hard figures on this. The courts refuse to compile figures on which gender, which parent gets custody of the children. But even if fathers are getting custody more often, this is not necessarily a good sign. It could simply mean that fathers are using the courts against mothers more successfully. A presumption of both parents being equally involved in the lives of children is much healthier than allowing one parent to unilaterally depart and throw the other parent out of the family and out of the lives of the children. So I'm not convinced that there is a shift in favor of fathers. If there is, it's not necessarily the way it should be, not necessarily healthy any more so than a shift in favor of mothers.
Okay, then in your opinion, what should the burden of proof be? If one parent says that the other parent is abusive in some way or dangerous in some way, what standards of proof have got to be met, in your opinion?
Well, that parent should have, you're right, a parent should have a burden of proof to prove that the other parent is unfit before separating that parent from his or her children. Child abuse is a crime. Spousal abuse is a crime, and we have laws against violent assault in, as far as I know, every jurisdiction in this country. If you simply adjudicated domestic violence and child abuse as violent assault, like any other crime, with due process protections for the accused, this would solve the problem. Unfortunately, these alleged offenses have blurred the distinction between private behavior, which is legal, and criminal behavior, which of course is illegal. What we need is a categorical distinction between private behavior and crime in the home as we have anywhere else.
Okay. Now, to go to the title of your book, Taken into Custody, does this refer to the state occasionally taking over the custody of children? Is that treated in your book at all?
Well, yes, that is part of it. Effectively, during divorce, children do become wards of the state. Custody goes to of the children effectively, resides not with the mother or the father, but with the state. But it also refers to the criminalization of parents. As a result of the divorce process and other government actions, parents are criminalized. Innocent, law-abiding parents who have done nothing wrong are criminalized. Their contact with their children is a criminal act. They are liable to arrest for trying to see their own children. They are liable to arrest for being in their own homes if they're accused of spousal or child abuse. They are liable to arrest if they cannot make extortionate child support payments, which may be way beyond their means and which they may have done nothing to incur. So children are taken into custody by the divorce machinery. The parents are also criminalized. They're also taken into custody by the divorce machinery. This is a very serious violation of civil liberties and civil rights in this country. I believe it is the most serious violation of civil rights in America today.
Okay, if you are in a situation where you are afraid that a divorce may be impending and that you may be put through the mill in this way, what steps can you take proactively to minimize the damage when and if it happens?
That's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer for that. There is really very little you can do. One line of thought, of course, is that the best protection parents have from this is simply not to have children in the first place. That's what Attorney Jed Abraham writes in his book.
Well, it looks like I'm on the right track anyway.
Well, the other solution is even more frightening. Another line of thought says that the best defense is an offense, that if you grab the children and run away first, you are most likely to prevail. The judge will give you custody temporarily, which is effectively permanent. The judge will give you child support and other monetary windfalls. So it's a kind of race to the courtroom, like the old nuclear race to the trigger. Whoever snatches first survives.
Is that so? I had no idea. So in other words, if I'm married and I suspect that my wife is about to leave me for somebody who's richer, handsomer, and cooler, why then my smartest move would be to pack the kids into the car and fill them up with a Happy Meal or two and drive them over to my parents' place.
Well, I'm certainly not advocating that, but the logic of the divorce system today means that, logically speaking, that is probably your best defense, yes.
Oh dear. So what can be done about that?
What can be done is we need to change the laws and the procedures governing divorce and child custody immediately. Psychotherapeutic remedies, feel-good talk about reconciliation, about mediation, about counseling, and these sorts of things, these are pretty much worthless.
Okay, but these changes in the law that you speak of, they all have to be done at the state level, am I right?
Well, yes. Custody and divorce law do pertain to the state level, and any laws in divorce or in custody, such as shared parenting, would be most appropriate at the state level. But there are federal precedents, again, for parents' rights to the care and custody of their children. So you could envision that there is a body of federal constitutional case law, which would give federal courts the jurisdiction not to change custody law to determine custody, but to guarantee the rights of parents and their children not to be separated without due process of law. Unfortunately, the federal courts refuse to get involved in this, arbitrarily claiming that they have no jurisdiction in domestic relations cases.
Okay. Well, now on that note, I'm going to cut away from you for just half a moment to remind our viewers that this show is sponsored in part by the Libertarian Party of New York, and here in New York City, you can go to the website of the Manhattan chapter of the Libertarian Party at www.manhattanlp.org, and there you will find links to other libertarian websites. You will find basic information about the Libertarian Party and about libertarian thought and philosophy, and from there we might just convert you after all. Once again, that website is www.manhattanlp.org. And we are back once again with Dr. Stephen Baskerville, the author of Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, against Fathers, Marriage, and the Family. Now, you mentioned at the top of the program, Dr. Baskerville, that in some ways the government would actually prefer that married people be divorced rather than stay married. Did you really mean that, or did I misunderstand you?
I don't think there's any question about that. G.K. Chesterton once said that the family and marriage is the main rival to the state's power, the main check on the power of the state. And what we've seen in the last few decades, if not longer, is a steady move of courts, social service bureaucracies, and other government agencies to forcibly break up families, to encourage divorce, to encourage fatherless and parentless children in many cases, to create trumped-up charges of domestic violence, of child abuse, to do anything to sever the relationship both between spouses and between parents and children.
Okay, well, it is true that divorce rates have risen dramatically in the past half century, and so have illegitimacy rates. But you suggest that this is done with the complete approval of the government, that they like to see this happen, correct?
Well, I can't say their state of mind, but this is certainly being, the instrument of this is certainly the government, absolutely. This is not a spontaneous problem of spouses deciding to part ways. This is definitely a power grab which one spouse usually perpetrates with the assistance of courts, lawyers, psychotherapists, social workers, and other agents of the state, yes.
Okay, well, I would have to agree with you because I've seen it myself. Do you have experience with this, Dr. Baskerville? Have you been through the divorce process yourself?
I have been through family courts, yes. I've seen these courts from the inside.
Have you children of your own?
Yes, I do have 2 children.
Okay, and what was your experience with the family courts? Any anecdotes you'd like to share with us?
Well, you really have to see these courts in person almost to believe what goes on. I was summoned to court on a few hours' notice. My children were abducted from my home. I was summoned to court on a few hours' notice. I was stripped of the right to see my children. I was told I had no right to see my children except what my spouse allowed, permitted. I was told to make child support payments of 2/3 of my salary, about $1,200 a month. I was left with about $900 a month of disposable income to live on and support 2 children. I have been stripped of any right to make any decisions about my children, and unfortunately, this is not unusual at all. This is a fairly typical scenario.
So you hadn't done anything, as far as you know, to provoke this type of action?
At no time have I been accused of any legal wrongdoing, either criminal or civil. That's exactly right. It's not necessary to be accused of any wrongdoing whatsoever. Now, private imperfections are another matter, but our system of due process of law is supposed to be based on recognized criminal or civil wrongdoing, not human imperfection. And in my case, and in the vast majority of cases, and we can document this, there is no even allegation, let alone proof or conviction, of civil or criminal wrongdoing for the parent to be stripped of their children and their private lives effectively criminalized.
Well, has the situation been resolved to any degree?
In my case,
yes.
No, it hasn't. It's never resolved, really, until the children are grown. If I try to see my children when I'm not authorized by the court, I will be liable to arrest. If I cannot pay 2/3 of my income every month in child support, I will be liable to arrest. If I go near my children, if I'm accused of domestic violence or child abuse and I fail to vacate my home, I will be subject to arrest. This is the reality that millions of Americans live with today.
Well, in retrospect, is there anything you could have done differently to spare yourself this type of financial and personal ruin?
In many cases, no. And I was living in a foreign country. I could have stayed in a foreign country and never returned to the United States. But that was an unusual case. Most people do not have that option. I could have stayed in where I was living in Europe and avoided any subjecting myself to the jurisdiction of American family courts. I chose not to. I chose to return to this country to be with my children when they were kidnapped and brought to the United States.
Oh, dear. Well, are there any organizations anywhere in the United States that you can go to for support, for advice, for practical intervention?
Well, our organization, the American Coalition for Fathers and Children, consists of a network of groups throughout the country. Most groups working on this are local. Our affiliates are local. We have affiliates in many states throughout the country. If you go to our website, acfc.org, you will find a list of local affiliate organizations.
acfc.org?
acfc.org, the American Coalition for Fathers and Children.
Okay. So the apparent idea behind this is that fathers get, generally speaking, far the worse of it than mothers. And from my own observation, that appears to be the case. But do you occasionally work with mothers or with organizations that advocate for parents of either sex?
Yes, most of our local affiliates, in fact, do advocate for non-custodial parents of either sex. In fact, one local group I know in New Jersey will tell you that about 50%, they have many cases of non-custodial mothers going through the same injustice. And they will tell you that about half of those mothers have former spouses who are in some way connected with the judiciary, either as lawyers or judges or enforcement officials of some kind or social workers. Okay. And that confirms, I think, my theory that much of this is politically driven. Fathers who have connections with the legal industry can often turn the tables and inflict the same injustice on mothers that many mothers inflict on fathers.
Okay, I dare say that's the case. Another question I'm curious about is we hear so much now these days about the subject of gay marriage or civil unions between persons of the same sex. Does that complicate matters with regard to child custody?
It certainly does complicate things. Now, how that's going to work out in the long run is difficult to say. But it's interesting to note that I believe I've written, and I believe I can prove that much of the controversy over same-sex marriage and same-sex adoptions has proceeded directly out of the controversy with divorce. In other words, the desire of great gay couples to marry, to adopt children, and so forth, largely proceeds from the way that heterosexual marriage has broken down under the pressure of the divorce industry. I can show you quotations from advocates of gay marriage who will tell you that the only reason they're interested in gay marriage is because of the way marriage has been debased and degraded by heterosexual groups through the divorce process. So our failure to address this process of divorce and child custody among heterosexuals is what is leading to the breakdown of marriage in other areas of our society as well.
Wait, let me see if I understand you correctly. You're saying that certain gay people are saying that because the state of marriage has been so degraded by heterosexual couples, they are now more eager to enter into such a contract because of what they might conceivably get out of the other person later on. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, precisely. In fact, I can show you quotations from very prominent gay rights advocates who will say, if you wish to go back to monogamous heterosexual marriage of the 1950s, where people were expected to stay married for life, if that's your definition of marriage, we're not interested. We're interested in marriage because it is the economic benefits it provides for the most part, which is all that's really left of marriage, thanks to the weakening of marriage by heterosexual couples through divorce.
Okay. So, in your opinion, what kind of a contract should we have? I mean, marriage, when you get right down to it, is a contract. In your opinion, what should that contract look like in order to preserve the rights of both spouses and to preserve the well-being of the children, if any?
Well, you're right. It is a contract, and there is a clause in our Constitution saying that no state shall abrogate the enforcement of contracts. And so it is, again, one instance of how modern divorce law is unconstitutional. It should be an enforceable contract. There should be penalties for the party that breaks it. There should be, if we want to legislate known grounds, in other words, specific grounds which would permit a divorce, as was once the case, then we should do that. But the point is that couples need to know, people need to know when they enter into this contract, under what circumstances it can be abrogated, what are the likely consequences of having it abrogated, and understand that this is something which when they enter into it, they need to know the terms of it. What we've created instead is a bait and switch. People marry under the understanding that they are entering into an enforceable contract, and if they are unfaithful to it, there will be penalties. In fact, the penalties are almost always inflicted upon the spouse that is faithful to it.
Okay, now you mentioned at the top of the program no-fault divorce, which you say is the whole big problem, and I'm inclined to believe you, but is no-fault divorce prevalent in every state of the Union or just in some?
Effectively, it is, and I don't want to blame no-fault divorce entirely because there's many other developments that took place at the same time. No-fault divorce is an indication of it, and simply repealing it or changing no-fault divorce would help. It would not be a panacea. Today, overwhelmingly, the battleground is children, and the pressing, urgent issue we must confront today is child custody. We must protect the parent-child bond. One way of doing that is protecting the rights of parents to the care and custody of their children. Another way is a presumption of, all else being equal, of shared parenting of parents who do divorce or separate.
And then in some states you have common law marriage, and in other states you do not. Does that complicate the issue as well?
Not very much. Marriage has been so debased that it really doesn't matter whether you're married or not today. You can still suffer the same injustices as far as your children and as far as the finances, whether you're married or not.
So in other words, if I were to impregnate a woman out of wedlock, and I suddenly got angry at her and wanted to hurt her for some reason, I could take that child away from her even though I had not been living with her as a spouse or living as the father of that child. Is that right?
As a man, it would be very difficult, but you could in theory do it, yes. The point is that marriage affords no protection to fathers or to mothers either. A married father or mother has no more protection in divorce in family law today than an unmarried parent does.
Okay, so do you believe that maybe divorce should be made a little more difficult? Would that help matters at all?
I believe that would help matters, yes. I believe there should be penalties and consequences for the spouse that abrogates the agreement, that breaks the contract. But again, we need to address the custody issue, because that is the urgent question today. That's what's leaving children fatherless. That's what's creating such havoc in our society today with this swarms of fatherless children.
What is the first step you would take then in order to alleviate the current custody situation?
I would urge a presumption of shared parenting, where all else being equal, parents share custody of their children, roughly equally share authority and time with their children on a roughly 50-50 basis. Now, if there's fault, if there's abuse, if there's violence, if there's problems, then there's leeway for one parent to have dominant, the preponderance of time or authority. But all else being equal, parents should be treated equally, mothers and fathers, and they should share equally in the custody of their children.
Would be specific criteria, benchmarks, burdens of proof, and so forth before one parent could be deprived of custody. Is that correct?
Right, and they should be very clear. We can't have, what we have now is a situation where judges determine subjectively what is in the best interest of a child. This usually ends up being what is in the best interest of the judge.
To make the government the final arbiter of what's in the best interest of a child, in my opinion, and in most libertarians' opinion. On that note, we are going to have to say goodnight. But Dr. Stephen Baskerville, thank you very much for being on the show. The title of your book, once again, is Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Families, and Marriage. Dr. Stephen Baskerville, thanks very much. I am Joseph Dobrian. Join us another time for another edition of Hardfire.
Hardfire is funded in part by the Libertarian Party of New York.